Hello again, YouTube. It's your new friend, Ted Filson, here for another Ubisoft Quickie. If you're new to the internet, you may not yet have heard of the downfall of Ubisoft. But if that is the case, all you really need to know is that Ubisoft is a giant video game company whose stock has been getting absolutely demolished over the past few years. Everyone else in the world today, I'm going to explain in a bit more detail what actually killed Ubi, or if not killed, has been giving them the beating. As a reminder, I did make a nice long deep dive on this. I can link in the description for anyone who wants a bit more of the story. Also, if you were curious about this newly announced Tencent deal and are suspicious about whether or not your typical sources actually understand the transaction, I have a video covering that too. So, with all that being said, let's get into it. So, what really killed Ubi? Well, I think the short version is, in fact, I know the short version is, to put a nice bow on the topic, Ubi's expenses grew faster than their revenue, and instead of immediately cutting staff dramatically, they took out more debt to cover the losses. This trend repeated a few times, and now they have less cash than ever, more debt than ever, and still have not sufficiently cut their expenses. Okay, now that's a lot to digest, but I wanted to at least get it out there, because that is basically the whole shebang right there. They just spent too much money, and instead of cutting back, they maxed out their credit cards and just kept making bets. And I think one of the interesting things here is that I can basically pinpoint the exact moment they shat the bed.
Watch this, Lise. You can actually pinpoint the second when his heart rips in half. And now.
Also, one obvious question, can Ubi recover from this? And the answer is absolutely. But in the absence of Musk-esque machete swinging, it'll likely be a long, slow struggle and turnaround if they just don't sell off their IP. Okay, so back to the goods. Take a look at this graph. This shows a few key data points from 2019 to today. The stock price is the columns in the background, so you can just ignore them for this bit. But you have sales and expenses, the ins and the outs of money. That's the light green and light pink lines. They are where the drama takes place. But where we see the result is really in the other two lines. Debt, which is the dark pink line, and cash, the dark green line. For today, we're really focusing on this section of the graph, 2022, 2023, and 2024. So let's first clear up the pink and green, rev and expenses, because the green line is dollars coming in, and the pink line is dollars leaving. So you know that the green line should always be above the pink line. If it isn't, that means you're losing money. You're spending more than you're making. You should also know the higher the green line is above the pink line, the better. That means they're making even more money. And while it should be pretty clear, in 2022, they lost a bunch of money. Expenses were too high. 2023, they corrected it a bit, but they couldn't hang on. And in 2024, they went back to losing money. Pretty straightforward so far. But hell, 1 year of bloated expenses doesn't sound that bad, right? Well, let's just see. Now take a look at debt and cash. And I get that debt and cash may be a bit more abstract for some people, and that's fair. Companies use debt in complicated ways. But just try thinking of it like a person and a credit card. If one of your friends said to you, yo man, I got about $100K in savings and about $100K in credit card debt, you might say, okay, sounds like a lot of debt, but, I guess you have it under control. Now, if that same guy came back to you in a couple years and said, yo, so I'm now down to about 40K in savings, and my debt is now up to about 150K. You wouldn't need a finance degree to say something like, bro, maybe chill out on the spending. And it's really that simple. When your expenses spike or your revenue gets a little unpredictable, you really only have two options. You can cut expenses and tighten your belt, or you can just start emptying your savings account and borrowing money. And you can see it all right here. When a year like 2022 comes around, that's a wake-up call. It is a fork in the road. And we can see plainly what Ubi did. They said, screw it. Just keep borrowing and just keep spending. One of these flippin' iPhone games will save us. And from that moment on, their debt just keeps going up and their cash just keeps dwindling. And remember, every dollar they borrow actually contributes to cash on hand. So when you see cash stay flattish from 21 to 22, but you also see debt increase by about 400 million, that means that they successfully pissed away about 400 million cash. And from 2022 to 2024, this is what we are seeing. And this is what is killing them. And this is also the reason Tencent now is now involved. It's because they didn't cut expenses. And now it's too late. With all their debt payments and their limited cash on hand, they basically don't have enough money to weather the storm any longer. Without someone giving them a huge amount of money, they would undeniably be at risk of straight up bankruptcy. Which is, of course, why Tencent gave them a cool $1 billion, but not in the form of debt. And it has certainly saved or at least extended their life. But okay, we're not here to talk about Tencent. We want to know how they got here. And depending on how hard you like to nerd on accounting principles and Excel spreadsheets, this will either be an entertaining or potentially painfully boring story. But let's do it. Let's identify the straw that broke the camel's back. And we will start wide lens and zoom in. So, first off, you may have already figured it out. It was the expenses growing too much in 2022. Correct. But let's break that down a bit. Well, they report on a few different types of expenses, although they never break them down too far. So we can tell which bucket might have grown more this year. It turns out R&D expenses specifically grew by 612 million, which is basically double any other year ever R&D cost. It literally went from like the 600 to 700 mil range and exploded to 1.4 billion. First time ever. Massive jump. And I mean, everything else looked cool. I can't overstate how big of a swing this is. R&D costs basically doubled in 2022. So I guess that's their problem. Well, we could leave it there, but it sort of begs more questions, doesn't it? I mean, did they do this on purpose? Did they see this coming? Also, what's an R&D? Okay, so last one first. R&D just means research and development. And it actually gets pretty complicated how it's calculated, but for now, just think developers. This is them spending money on making games. It is them paying developers to build their video games. Okay, fair enough. So how did this happen? And was it just their plan to spend this much money? And they thought rev would be way higher or what? Well, those are good questions, so let's keep going. It turns out, no, they did not see this coming, and I can even prove it to you. Take a look at the statements on screen and their relevant dates. This is Ubisoft saying, in order, first, in May of 2022, strong revenue growth, and expecting profits in March of 2023 of around $400 million. Okay, word. Next, we get a little touch base from the boys at Ubi, July of 22. How's it cooking, guys? Still feel good about that $400 million of profit? They still think it's solid growth and 400 mil of profits. Roger that. Okay, we're getting close to the end of the year, October of 2022. Do they still like the prediction? Yes, they confirm it again in October. Revenue growth and 400 mil of profit. It wasn't until January of 2023. Side note, their fiscal year for 2022 actually ends in March of 2023, in case you're getting confused by the dates. So it wasn't until January of 2023 that they finally came out and said, shit, guys, we done goofed a little bit. Our new estimates are more like negative 400 million, and maybe revenue won't grow so much. And quick side note here, Jan 2023, how did Ubisoft stock perform on that day? Train wreck. Got it. Okay, moving on. So, we knew that was coming, so no major shock for us. But you should be wondering, how in the hell? Revenue projections fell a little bit, but that basically means they accidentally spent around $500 million on development? Really? For the year to be over, revenue projections dropped by a couple hundred mil, but profit projections dropped by $800 million 2 months before the end of the year? I mean, revenue can be hard to predict, but how in the hell are you going to accidentally spend 500 mil more on developers than you realized? Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Still zooming in, and we have our next question. How does that even happen? How could they have not seen this coming? Well, the answer is surprisingly simple. If we look at this press release, the one on January 11th, the one where they finally downgrade earnings by almost $1 billion, the one that precedes the $600 million jump in R&D, the one that made the market do this, and the one that it appears represents the exact moment Ubisoft looked up from what I can only assume was a delicious plate of snails and frog legs soaked in wine and noticed they were in trouble. So if we take a look here, what do we see? Well, first off, we see them throwing Just Dance and Mario Rabbids under the bus, which it's like, come on, guys. What even is a rabbit? Who cares? Don't give us that crap. You can see it right here, though, kinda nonchalantly. Oh, it's not our fault, lots of macroeconomic factors, blah, 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 and we're depreciating about 500 mil additional of R&D. But Mr. Filson, you said R&D was just development cost. How can they depreciate it unexpectedly? Also, Mr. Filson, well, what in the shit does depreciate mean? Well, those are both good questions. And unfortunately, it's not that simple. So think of it like this. For some reason, Ubisoft doesn't have to recognize these costs when they happen. Instead, they spread the expenses out. And they do so after a game releases. Kind of weird, but that's how it works. So if they spend $1 billion making a game, that $1 billion doesn't show up on their income statement as an expense in R&D until the day after the game releases. And even then, they do it in chunks over a few years. So if I make one game all year and it's my first game ever, I show no revenue and no R&D expenses. Then, after I release the game, I start selling it, and I also start recognizing the expenses associated with it. That way, the money coming in and going out are sort of lined up. And that kind of makes sense, right? It may sound dumb, and it may be, but that principle of timing revenue and expenses is pretty common in accounting. So, okay, they had some surprise depreciation of R&D. And now that we know that it's not just straight expenses, like it's not as simple as adding up your payroll and figuring out how much your expenses are going to be, R&D costs are spread out over time, so it can be a little mushy. So, okay, that sort of makes sense, but how does that happen? And how could it sneak up on them? Like, shouldn't it still be somewhat predictable? Well, there's a few potential reasons these expenses get depreciated unexpectedly. The most obvious and the most relevant is when you cancel a game. And that also kind of makes sense. If you are generally delaying expenses so that you can absorb them once the revenue associated with those expenses comes in, and you cancel a game, well then you can't very well delay those expenses anymore, can you? Nope. So you got to realize them all at once. This also actually applies with pausing development for extended periods of time and delaying titles. So that's it then. They had to cancel some games unexpectedly. And they even said as much. And so that is where this came from. Sorta. But if it was just that simple, wouldn't we expect to see R&D costs return to normal in the following year? Like back down to maybe under 700 million? If this was all just Ubi taking it on the chin for a couple unexpected cancellations. Yeah, maybe. And do we? No. We see some reduction, but they never get R&D back down to 2021 levels. Okay, so I lied. That's not quite the center of the Tootsie Pop. We still have some unanswered questions. One, well, what games got canceled and or delayed to cause this? And two, what else is going on if it wasn't just a simple one game cancellation? Because obviously this problem has continued. And lucky for us, I believe the answer to these questions can be provided simultaneously. So let's rewind momentarily, just about 7 months before this dreadful announcement, all the way back to July of 2022. Let's take a look at what they call their pipeline of games that they were bragging about. And would you look at that? 4 games on this list got canceled or delayed so hard they wish they were canceled. And what do you know? All 4 are free to play. And I don't mean Hungry Shark free to play. No, these are big, big investments. These are real swings at the games as a service plate that have been canceled. And if you go back in time, you'll notice these are actually some of Ubi's biggest and earliest attempts at this. So, no shock there. Whenever a healthy consumer-facing company like this collapses, you can generally blame the MBAs and or the ESGs. And here it looks like the MBAs are leading the charge. Okay, so that explains half of it. The answer to the question, where did all these expenses come from? Well, this is what they've been investing in. This is why their expenses increased dramatically, as well as their development staff. It was the decision to shift away from single player experiences and to try and find a way to create their own never ending cash machine. And by the way, this fateful decision was made likely back in 2019, because although we do not see R&D costs spike until 2022, we can see it coming a mile away. And that goes back to this idea of delaying expenses. If you look here, I am showing CapEx of Ubisoft on a yearly basis. CapEx is the amount that they actually spent on development, instead of these delayed R&D costs that I was talking about earlier, which is really just the spreading out of these CapEx numbers. So CapEx, even though it does not show up as an expense, is the actual dollar amount they spend on development. And as you can see, it really started jumping maybe even as far back as 2019. Prior to that, it was closer to the 700s, which is right in line with what we see historically. So, we can see here that CapEx is still way out of whack, even though, since the high in 2022, it has come down a bit. But as we know, these costs are delayed. So while costs have come down gradually, we know there still will be a healthy 2-year delay before we see actual expenses catch up. And this is even assuming that they cut deep enough on their development costs. But it does get dumber. We can also see that CapEx per employee has increased quite a bit. Not a crazy jump, but 10% increase in 1 year is pretty substantial. And it's hard to imagine a scenario where costs would need to increase that much on a per employee basis. Okay, and what else? We also have the book value of the 2 asset categories. Now, I am getting a little technical here, but these 2 bottom rows, not the red ones that are showing growth, but the black font ones with real numbers, these 2 rows are showing growing total amount of the development costs that have been incurred, meaning they already spent this money on making games. but they just haven't expensed these dollars yet. And we have it in two categories: costs incurred on projects that that have not yet been released, and costs incurred on projects that have already been released, but have not been fully expensed. And as you can see, these two numbers have not even begun to drop, and they may be the most important yet. In terms of Ubi righting the ship, if we go all the way back to the original question, why is Ubi dying? And the answer is that R&D costs got too high. Well, these two numbers are just the piling up of those future R&D costs. They can be thought of literally as future R&D costs. So, and this is critical. If we are wondering if we can expect Ubisoft's future R&D costs to be lower, these two numbers say absolutely not. I mean, they can eventually, but the pile of costs that need to be expensed is still growing. So as far as I can tell, we cannot even expect R&D to drop much until, maybe 2026. So there you have it. Ubisoft's development expenses are out of control and basically double what they were back in 2020 for no reason. And because their major single player releases stayed more or less consistent over this time, but we saw a massive spike in free to play focus, we know where they were spending the money. And because we can line up this bonus depreciation that I talked about with some major cancellations and delays, all in the free to play space, we have all the more confidence that they are connected. And finally, by looking at the rolling totals of software development costs yet to be realized, we can see that even with all their cutbacks, they still have a few more years of R&D expenses being totally out of whack. So friends, that is why we can say with some confidence, we do know the exact moment Ubisoft blew the game. The exact fork in the road where they made a wrong turn and can't seem to recover. It was this thirst for reoccurring revenue, and it was all the way back in 2019 and 2020. So, I know this one was a bit more technical than usual, but I hope you learned something today and can take some satisfaction in the knowledge that you now understand significantly more about Ubisoft's problems than the typical journalist who gets paid to report on them. So, if you liked this video, feel free to like it, and I hope to see you again next time.